the natural form of air, the supernatural form of air, the temporal form of air, the spiritual form of air, the natural form of earth, the supernatural form of earth, the temporal form of earth, the spiritual form of earth, the natural form of fire, the supernatural form of fire, the temporal form of fire, the spiritual form of fire, the natural form of gem, the supernatural form of gem, the temporal form of gem, the spiritual form of gem, the natural form of ice, the supernatural form of ice, the temporal form of ice, the spiritual form of ice, the natural form of lightning, the supernatural form of lightning, the temporal form of lightning, the spiritual form of lightning, the natural form of metal, the supernatural form of metal, the temporal form of metal, the spiritual form of metal, the natural form of thunder, the supernatural form of thunder, the temporal form of thunder, the spiritual form of thunder, the natural form of water, the supernatural form of water, the temporal form of water, the spiritual form of water, the natural form of wood, the supernatural form of wood, the temporal form of wood, the spiritual form of wood, the natural form of light, the supernatural form of light, the temporal form of light, the spiritual form of light, the natural form of dark, the supernatural form of dark, the temporal form of dark, the spiritual form of dark, the natural form of anointing, the supernatural form of anointing, the temporal form of anointing, the spiritual form of anointing, the natural form of unanointing, the supernatural form of unanointing, the temporal form of unanointing, the spiritual form of unanointing, the natural form of blessing, the supernatural form of blessing, the temporal form of blessing, the spiritual form of blessing, the natural form of cursing, the supernatural form of cursing, the temporal form of cursing, the spiritual form of cursing, the natural form of predestiny, the supernatural form of predestiny, the temporal form of predestiny, the spiritual form of predestiny, the natural form of destiny, the supernatural form of destiny, the temporal form of destiny, the spiritual form of destiny, the natural form of faith, the supernatural form of faith, the temporal form of faith, the spiritual form of faith, the natural form of fear, the supernatural form of fear, the temporal form of fear, the spiritual form of fear, the natural form of archangels, the supernatural form of archangels, the temporal form of archangels, the spiritual form of archangels, the natural form of archdemons, the supernatural form of archdemons, the temporal form of archdemons, the spiritual form of archdemons, the natural forms of air, the supernatural forms of air, the temporal forms of air, the spiritual forms of air, the natural forms of earth, the supernatural forms of earth, the temporal forms of earth, the spiritual forms of earth, the natural forms of fire, the supernatural forms of fire, the temporal forms of fire, the spiritual forms of fire, the natural forms of gem, the supernatural forms of gem, the temporal forms of gem, the spiritual forms of gem, the natural forms of ice, the supernatural forms of ice, the temporal forms of ice, the spiritual forms of ice, the natural forms of lightning, the supernatural forms of lightning, the temporal forms of lightning, the spiritual forms of lightning, the natural forms of metal, the supernatural forms of metal, the temporal forms of metal, the spiritual forms of metal, the natural forms of thunder, the supernatural forms of thunder, the temporal forms of thunder, the spiritual forms of thunder, the natural forms of water, the supernatural forms of water, the temporal forms of water, the spiritual forms of water, the natural forms of wood, the supernatural forms of wood, the temporal forms of wood, the spiritual forms of wood, the natural forms of light, the supernatural forms of light, the temporal forms of light, the spiritual forms of light, the natural forms of dark, the supernatural forms of dark, the temporal forms of dark, the spiritual forms of dark, the natural forms of anointing, the supernatural forms of anointing, the temporal forms of anointing, the spiritual forms of anointing, the natural forms of unanointing, the supernatural forms of unanointing, the temporal forms of unanointing, the spiritual forms of unanointing, the natural forms of blessing, the supernatural forms of blessing, the temporal forms of blessing, the spiritual forms of blessing, the natural forms of cursing, the supernatural forms of cursing, the temporal forms of cursing, the spiritual forms of cursing, the natural forms of predestiny, the supernatural forms of predestiny, the temporal forms of predestiny, the spiritual forms of predestiny, the natural forms of destiny, the supernatural forms of destiny, the temporal forms of destiny, the spiritual forms of destiny, the natural forms of faith, the supernatural forms of faith, the temporal forms of faith, the spiritual forms of faith, the natural forms of fear, the supernatural forms of fear, the temporal forms of fear, the spiritual forms of fear, the natural forms of archangels, the supernatural forms of archangels, the temporal forms of archangels, the spiritual forms of archangels, the natural forms of archdemons, the supernatural forms of archdemons, the temporal forms of archdemons, the spiritual forms of archdemons,